humans are just susceptible. It's kind of, I think, the dark side of a lot of our good qualities, like our need to belong. You start to think about everything. Like you have any symptom and you're like, oh, this is a conflict shock. And then you have to put it into these categories, and it restricts our ability to think critically. That's what it does. It becomes more and more rigid. It becomes more extreme over time. And so you do get to the place of being like, I'm striving for further purity. Like I need to become more and more clean, more and more perfect.
As we have talked about many times on this podcast over the years, conventional medicine has failed many people, prompting a search for answers elsewhere. German New Medicine is an alt-health trend that has exploded in popularity in recent years. It is attractive to so many, including me and my guest, once, because it acknowledges the role that emotions and trauma play in physical health and symptom manifestation, something that mainstream medicine still somehow refuses to do. But just because some aspects of an ideology are true and helpful does not mean that the entire framework is valid. Critical thinking and humility are essential tools for navigating information overload and complex frameworks, especially in the realms of health and spirituality. The allure of certain and specialized knowledge can lead people to adopt rigid belief systems that don't hold up to critical thinking, and the zealotry of believing that your group's ideology will save the world only further strengthens unconscious confirmation bias, along with other logical fallacies common in GNM, like loading the language, heads I lose, tails you win, us versus them thinking, antisemitic conspiracies, etc. I think that's better said. Heads, you lose. Tails, I win. This episode has been years in the making, and I have been asked time and time again for my take on GNM. When I was sent Demetra's essay on the subject, I knew that I had finally found the right person to have this conversation with. Her past cult experience and my years of deep dives into culty thinking and behavior provide a lens through which to view this phenomenon. Though we do not think that GNM is a cult, cultishness is a spectrum, and GNM is definitely on that spectrum. Also, its tenets are demonstrably false through, again, critical thinking. So let's explore. I'm going to read you the first few paragraphs of Demetra's essay because I think it captures the experience that so many of us have when we get interested in German New Medicine, and because it gives just a little bit of a foundation for anyone who doesn't know anything about it. Oh, that's just the healing phase, she said authoritatively, looking at the rash that had spread itself across the backs of my hands, deeply infected and weeping fluid. Skin issues are a separation conflict. You just have to figure out what's causing it. I scanned through as many years of my life as I could. The first time I ever had eczema, it was on my legs, in my early 20s. Did that count? All of it was important, she nodded. There are a lot of separations that have occurred in the last decade of my life. I stared at my hands. Deaths, divorces, moving to another country, breakups, leaving a cult and having everyone turn against me. If only I knew for sure which one could be causing this, on the backs of my hands specifically. For the uninitiated, German New Medicine is the brainchild of a German doctor called Reich Hammer that he put forth initially as a cure for cancer. Back in the late 70s, Hammer's son Dirk was accidentally killed, and Hammer developed testicular cancer soon after. Though his cancer was cured by conventional means, Hammer concluded that the cancer was caused by the shock of his son's death and developed his theory that in every single instance, cancer is caused by an emotional shock or conflict. Eventually, this expanded to include all diseases. In GNM, every emotional shock creates a conflict in the organism, leading to all different kinds of health problems. The symptoms of the disease are the healing phase. For example, a tumor is just the natural healing of the conflict that caused the cancer. What kills people, according to Hammer, is the interference of doctors. If you're confused already, this is part of how it succeeds. I'll let you read the rest of her really brilliant essay for the resolution of the skin rash and to just further flesh out the ideas that we talk about here. Very grateful to have found it and really excited to share this conversation today, even though I'm also a little scared because I'm going to make a lot of people mad, including people I like and care about. The title for this episode includes the phrase a little bit culty. And this is an homage to one of my favorite podcasts, A Little Bit Culty, with Sarah and Nippy, who escaped Nexium and blew the whistle and have done a ton of work in the years since to share knowledge about cults and culty communities. They really have educated me so much on this phenomenon, and I'm really grateful. So I mean the title to be an homage to them. And of course, I link to that podcast in the show notes below. There is an awesome Patreon bonus to go along with this conversation. So when Demetra and I were talking and setting up this interview, I told her, I have a Patreon. My favorite thing to do for my patrons who literally make the show possible, as people always say, but it's true, is to have an extended conversation. I noticed that people tend to like that the most. I'm not sure what we could talk about. Are you open to just, seeing where our interview goes and then deciding what we'll talk about on Patreon? And she said yes. So when we finished the interview, I was so wildly curious about her cult experience, and she agreed to tell me all about it. So you'll hear her refer to her cult experience many times during this conversation. And if you want to get the details, find the Medicine Stories Patreon, and it's there. Okay, let's get into it. I love this conversation. I am feeling expanded and kind of freed up after speaking things that have been on my mind for many years now. And I hope it helps you to navigate your own experiences with German New Medicine. And as we say in this episode, we don't think that anyone who follows this framework is stupid. And we believe the people who have had healing experiences which they attribute to GNM. All right, here we go. Thank you, Demetra Gray, and thank you for listening. Hi, Demetra. Welcome to Medicine Stories.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I've been wanting to talk about this for years. I sent you the note that I've been keeping in my phone for over 2 years, just adding thoughts to it over time. And in recent months, I've been asked numerous times what I think about German New Medicine. And people also really wanted to know what my most recent podcast guest thought about it, my last 2 episodes. When she and I were discussing whether or not we were going to talk about that on this podcast, your Substack piece came out. And she sent it to me the day you published it. And we were like, oh, okay, well, she just said it all. So we won't talk about it. But over the month or so since you've published it, I've really been I was so happy that you planted your thought processes around it on the internet, because so many people are curious about German New Medicine, but are also finding the logical fallacies within it and are finding nowhere else online who what they're figuring out about it is being corroborated. So thank you so much for writing it, and thank you for being here.
I'm just so glad you found it, because I thought it was such a niche thing. I was like, I've been thinking about it for a couple of years too and wanting to write. And I just felt like something had to be out there so that anyone looking for it. But I didn't really imagine anyone would find it. So I'm so glad that you did.
Yeah, I mean, I've been waiting for it, I think, and for a long time I've been like, is it me who puts the thing out there? But it wasn't, it was you. And I'm so glad, because you took it to places I hadn't really thought of before. So let's start by saying that we both were genuinely interested in German New Medicine at one point. Why don't you talk about your story there?
I was super into it because I have tended to be, I'm very open-minded to new things, especially alternative health stuff. I've found so much useful information in that world, and I continue to do so. And I had a friend who was really, really into it. And so that was kind of how I was introduced. And then, of course, I went down all the rabbit holes and learning and trying to learn through the websites. At that time, I had just left a cult that I didn't quite know was a cult. I knew I had gone through this horrific experience. It was 2 years, but I was still in this place of I was completely destabilized for a year. I just didn't even know how that could have happened to me, what had happened. I didn't know who I was, what I believed. And GNM came in at this time where I was hesitant because I could see that there were some aspects that didn't feel quite right. And it felt a bit similar to the culty world I had just been in. And I was having more and more health issues. The health issues, I had some before, but they massively escalated once I had left the cult. It was just like I was in my nervous system was just like shot. I was so stressed. When I found GNM, I believed it. I was open to it. I thought this is all really interesting. And I actually had what I thought right up front was like an almost miraculous healing. I'd been bleeding for over a year, my last year, just straight, like it was insane. But it's hard to say what was the major thing that stopped it because I had also had all my blood work done. I was on a ton of supplements. So I was doing these supplements for a couple months. I started homeopathy. I took my first dose of that week. And then with my friend, we were talking about GNM and she like questioning what conflict I could possibly have about being a woman. And I couldn't think of anything. And then finally I landed on one from a couple years prior. And it felt so true. I still think that the emotional, like the emotions that were there were real. We don't have to go into it all, but I had gained a ton of weight. I had lost this connection from my vulva that I had had prior. Like, it's a long story, but I felt like, oh, there was this moment where I felt like, what kind of woman am I that I'm no longer like, I had lost this connection. I couldn't even my belly was so big, I couldn't reach myself. Like, it was this whole big, and I felt gross because I was constantly bleeding. There was a lot there. So there was clearly emotional stress wrapped up in that. And when I landed on it, I was like, wow, this is it. Like, this is the conflict. And then a few days later, I stopped bleeding and then I ovulated and I started cycling again. So I was like, wow, GNM is a miracle. But I also knew that the homeopathy had just happened. Like, I didn't know exactly what to attribute it to for sure. But I was a lot more open to GNM after that. And then, but the problem was I kept having more and more health issues, and GNM had like 100 different conflicts to explain each one. And I started dealing with just more and more serious consequences, like an autoimmune disorder where like I couldn't really function or move well. And so GNM, it started to show a lot of holes in it, and I started to trust it less and less. But it took me a long time. Like, I think it was the kind of dovetail of me learning a lot about cults because I finally figured out what had happened to me and I started learning about cults. And then I looked up GNM and I found that report that maybe you had found because I mentioned it in my piece. And I read it and I was like, but no one knows this. And then, yeah, over the last years, I've been working with more and more people. Like, everybody is people who I really respect and who are really smart people, therapists, somatic workers, all these people. Everyone's like, oh, I'm getting trained in GNM. And I'm like, what are you getting trained in? Do you know? But nobody knows. So, yeah, I had to write the piece because I was like, at least then someone can find something. But I did really believe in it completely. I think just because of my cult experience, I started being able to, it's easy to, I think, feel that something is off with something and you can just trust that. But it's nicer when you can sort of logically define this is why it feels like there are many different reasons why it feels off and I can explain them. I think helps.
Yeah, okay, we'll get into, let's say from the beginning that we're not saying that GNM is a cult. There are aspects of cults that are not present here. We're talking about a belief system and right, the parallels between like culty belief systems and what the mental gymnastics you have to do to really go all in on German numismatics.
Cults are on a spectrum. So like something being a cult would meet a lot of different criteria that no one even necessarily agrees on. But on the spectrum of like things that are not culty at all to things that are a cult, GNM is like it has a lot of culty aspects. It's because it's utilizing different aspects of mind control, which I know sounds extreme, but that's what it's called.
But you break it down really beautifully in your piece, and we'll get into that, especially you name like the 6 cult-like thought patterns in it. And for me, what I was seeing over the last 2 years is like just so much logical fallacy. The biggest one being confirmation bias, which I think is your first one that you list, and we'll talk about that. But so I too, and going back to, I was at my lowest point in health and energy wise. I had first come across the GNM idea framework loosely in like 2020, 2021, early COVID days. And I was just like, this is batshit crazy. The way the woman was presenting it was like really out there. But I was open. So I'm like, I'm really open-minded person. I love exploring new ideas, especially when it comes to health and the body. And so I was like, she's a little crazy. But then a couple years later, I was seeing it presented much more systematically, intelligently, clearly, cleanly. And I was like, okay, well, if, look at like these testimonials, this is really helping people. I'm going to get really into it. And I went deep, like I think you and I, so this is what I'm noticing is that the thing that first draws people in is the truth that has been ignored by mainstream medicine for years and years and years now, is that there is an emotional root to our symptoms, to our health issues. We all know this. I think everyone listening to this knows this. There are still people out there who don't know it. And in the past, even in my childhood, that was considered crazy. So it's a real relief for people, right, to step into a system that is telling them like, oh, that thing that happened to you, that like embedded somewhere in your body, in your tissues even, and is affecting you now still. That makes sense. That's the initial draw for people. But then when you really go into it, when you really learn about Dr. Hammer, or however you pronounce it, and okay, we'll get into the other stuff. So I'm just saying, for people who don't know the depths of like this man's philosophy, and that's another thing, it all comes from one man. I've noticed that a lot of people think that it's this system of knowledge that evolved in Germany over time from a group of people, and it's like really, well established and deeply rooted. And when I tell them no, it was one guy, they're like, oh, that kind of changes everything. It's like the cult of one infallible man.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed lately that a lot of the GNM influencers are shifting the language from German New Medicine to Germanic healing knowledge. And I think that this is kind of it's loading the language, right? This is one of your six that we'll talk about. And it gives people more of the impression that like, oh, this is a really old, well-established system of healing in this one region of the world that you just haven't heard about yet.
Yeah, not true.
No.
Did you have any healings that you felt, or not really?
No, not really. I spent a month or two really, really, really looking into it. But then at the same time, I connected with the woman who was my guest on the last two episodes, and really like fully took a different path, which is like hardcore biochemistry. So I was really looking at my body pain and back pain that I'd had for like 25 years. And I think this is one really important piece that I want to talk about today too, is that, so the basic idea of German New Medicine, and we're not going to explain everything because again, it took months and months of research for me to get the full framework, but you can get as a really good intro in your piece that I'll link to on Substack. But this idea that every symptom you have is the result of a conflict shock, something that happened at some point that you couldn't have anticipated and that deeply affected you. And so the thing is, all the categories of conflict shock within this system are things that every adult human has experienced. So musculoskeletal pain, which breaks down into like dozens and dozens and dozens of specific diagnoses, is a self-devaluation conflict. So have you ever felt bad about yourself? Have you ever felt shame or embarrassment, or like you weren't good enough? I mean, like, yes, of course I have. Everyone has. And following that route did not help my body pain. I was really excited at first. I really thought it would. Like, I'm going to uncover this. I almost bought a $2,000 course just talking about the self-devaluation conflict. Thank God I didn't do that. But you know what got rid of my 25-year body pain was supplementing calcium. I had been deficient in calcium probably my entire life. Looking back now, I know that. So I think that kind of immediately helped pull me out of it. And then over the next, again, few years, I just was listening to podcasts about it, reading posts about it, and being like, logical fallacy, logical fallacy, logical fallacy.
Mm. I think a big red flag is is, and I write this in the piece, but it's like anytime something becomes so rigid, it's like this is the ultimate truth and this is the only way and this is true 100% of the time. It's just a huge red flag because nobody, even if people are quite certain, like we can say we're quite certain, it seems that emotions play a role in most diseases, but you're not going to say, I know 100% of the time for every single case that your emotions are like, you just don't, we don't know. To pretend that we know that kind of thing is just, it doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. And to say like my sciatica and your sciatica have the exact same cause. Like you said, it's super rigid. It's like, it's interesting because I feel like the people drawn to it are like, it's this freeing alternative, free yourself from the confines of modern conventional medicine. But it's so much more rigid than even modern conventional medicine is, because it's like, well, this is the only answer and this is the only path forward.
And that's what makes it so attractive because it feels so certain. Like we're really just drawn as humans to certainty, to the answer, to
Yeah.
like, okay, someone's going to explain it. And I think it's less worrisome when someone is doing it for like back pain or a rash or something. It's like, okay, there's not the end of the world consequences for exploring emotional contributions to that, you know? And there's actually a guy, I don't know if you've heard of Dr. John Sarno.
I don't know.
He's done a lot with back pain and what he calls TMS, but it's essentially emotional. Like he has all this, and then people have followed and expanded on his stuff.
Do you know what that stands for?
It's super alternative. TMS, it's like something musculoskeletal, because his initial theory was that it's like neuroplastic pain. And so it goes along with pain science, and it's sort of, he theorizes that your muscles in this area are getting less oxygen. And so there's pain, but then the brain like learns the pain. So there's a lot, I mean, there's a lot in pain science in general that is extremely interesting because pain doesn't really make sense, right? Like everyone with the same MRIs doesn't experience the same amount of pain. So pain is really interesting. And it does seem that a lot of times pain equates with emotions in different ways. Like learning about that your pain can be emotional in nature sometimes stops people's pain. But that's the word, is sometimes. Like I think it's important to look at but that's why I think in a lot of cases when GNM seems to work for people, it's on these things that do have a safety component. Like you feel like, oh, here's the answer. I feel safer. I can relax. My stress comes down. I'm not focused on it anymore. And then it goes away. And I think that part is real, but that's not because of GNM
It's
itself
because
as a framework. Like
you found safety.
it's a different thing. Yeah, I think that we're exploring more, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's tension myositis
Yeah,
syndrome.
yeah, yeah.
And I've just the last few days been learning about the cell danger response, which also ties into this conversation, which is basically, this would be like implicated in autoimmune and chronic fatigue and all sorts of stuff where your cells are just like danger, danger, danger all the time and they never get the safety signal. So this is, when people are reacting to everything all the time, which is so common. So yeah, speaking of like certainty, and the draw we all have towards that, Dr. Hammer has his 5 biological laws, which is it different from or it grew out of the iron law of cancer? I mean, so he's really presenting this as like, this is the iron laws of biology when they have nothing to do with actual biology or physiology or biochemistry.
Initially and so this is really interesting. It's like if you don't know the history of it, then it's hard to understand. Like he initially had cancer himself, and he thinks that the cancer was caused by the death of his son. His son was accidentally shot. It was very sad. And so right after that, he learned that he had, I think it was prostate cancer.
Let me jump in here a little bit.
Yeah.
It's relevant that it was testicular cancer because his insight was my child dies and then the cells in my testicles start to proliferate because they want me to have more children. I'm pretty sure that because, it's like, oh my gosh, make more, make more. And my thought right there is it would make just as much sense because in GNM, every conflict shock causes either proliferation of cells or ulceration of cells, which those lead to various symptoms. It would make just as much sense to me that like the testicles or ovaries would ulcerate and like lose mass because they're like, oh my gosh, my child can die. Let's not do this again. It's like it could have gone either way just as easily.
He also says that so it was Dr. Moss who wrote the report that I had found. It's like 100 pages long. It was written, I think, in 2009 in Germany. He's not like a regular German doctor trying to expose Dr. Hamer. He's an alternative health, like he researches alternative health because he cares a lot about like the people using alternative ways to heal cancer. That's his thing. So Dr. Hamer, whatever, he initially brought this theory because he discovered he had cancer. Dr. Moss in his report says that they actually know, and I don't know, I'm not a doctor in this way, but he said that to discover cancer like that, the cancer would have been there for months, years prior. So that's kind of an also interesting thing, right? It's like he discovers it then, but it might have started way before the death of his son. And it seems likely that that's the case. Anyway, there's evidence that he healed it by conventional means, according to Dr. Moss. But then he joined those things together and he was like, this cancer is because of the death of my son, which is fine enough, like maybe. But then it very quickly, and you see this, I think it's with certain personalities, maybe more narcissistic personalities, or just this more character disturbed. I don't know. But in cults in general, you see this escalation of there's an idea, and then it quickly becomes extremely rigid and like, this is the only way. And so you see that in German New Medicine because he's like, this is like cancer is caused by a shock. And at first, the shock had to have 5 criteria. Like it had to be dramatic, it had to be really intense.
Unexpected.
Yeah. And then he, extrapolates that to now there's the 5 iron laws of cancer. Iron law, like they're there for every cancer. Now that's changed into the 5 biological laws because obviously it wasn't enough for it to stay just in cancer. He had discovered like God's gift to healing humanity from everything. And so now it's biological laws that apply to everything.
Right. Which is also a common theme in cults is this, we're going to save the world. Like I've got it.
We're doing a good thing. There's that quote from someone somewhere. No one joins a cult. They join a good thing.
Yes. Yes. Well, do you listen to a little bit culty?
Yeah, well, it comes from one of them. I watched their experience. Their experience was quite similar to mine in like the mind manipulation ways.
Yeah, well, it's all similar. I've, like I told you, I have not been involved in a cult-like situation, although I could very much see it happening when I was younger, in my 20s especially, which is when most people do join what they think is a good thing, which turns out to be a cult. But starting with the vow, starting with Nexium, starting with Sarah and Nippy, and a little bit culty, I have read every book, watched every documentary, listened to every podcast, including the books that are like, these are the common tenets of cults and of cult-like thinking. It's fascinating. I think there's a reason, like everyone, especially women, are so fascinated with this concept. And, like they always say on that podcast, we're in the golden age of cult recovery, but we're also in the golden age of cults. There are more cults and more cult-like thinking now than there ever was before. A lot of people think this is like a thing from the 70s or something, but it's more than ever. People are under the sway of this, and we're all susceptible to it. If you think you're too smart to fall for this kind of stuff, you're a prime target.
That was me. I was like, I'm way too smart to be in a cult. I would know it if I was in a cult.
Yeah.
We talked about cults all the time.
They all do. We're
not a cult because, but it's also interesting because, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because movements also don't have to have a leader to be a cult. And that's the really interesting part, is it's not always a leader who's doing it. Humans are just susceptible. It's kind of, I think, the dark side of a lot of our good qualities, like our need to belong. When we lose sight of what we're focusing on, like we lose sight of, usually cults, it's about love and healing and joy, like these positive things, but we lose sight of that when there's more power and more money, and groupthink starts to come in, and the more people there are, there's more rigidity. And what happens is it's like the movement itself becomes its own entity. Mm-hmm. And then all the people in it are like strengthening it. And you can conceptualize that any way you want, right? Like as just purely psychological or as like an actual sort of egregor entity of like it being some real in some way. But either way, it's like a known phenomenon and we see it happen everywhere. And so it's kind of crazy because then you don't even need a leader to enforce it because people in the ideology, like they start enforcing it on there. So, and the thing just, it has its own momentum. It's super crazy.
Totally. Yeah, and this is the perfect example of that. He's been dead for 2017, was it? I think, and he never had like a harem of women or just the things that people tend to think of when they think of cults. That wasn't present here. Gosh, I have this is like cleansing my soul. Just all these thoughts I've had and wanted to talk about publicly for so many years. It feels really good to finally be doing this with you. When did you really switch though to like, oh, this whole system is actually wrong?
Well, I think it was when I found that piece. I don't remember when it was.
Dr. Moss's report.
Yeah, because I was searching because it kept coming up and I kept seeing it and I was bothered by it because it was bothering me because I was having these increasingly worse symptoms. And I still had this pull to like, if I could just figure it out, if I just knew what the conflict was, then like all of my autoimmune symptoms would go away. I was dealing with this serious thing and I was in this sort of situation. So it kept pulling at me and I kept knowing there was something wrong. And so I don't know how I found that report. It's so hard to find. It must have been sometimes when I'm searching, I just get so like
Yeah,
upset. Like
I didn't find that report, and I was like every month, German New Medicine fraud, German New Medicine,
yeah.
just trying to find people talking about it.
I don't know how I found it, but I found it. And when I found it, I was like, I think I was in the car. I read it on my phone the first time, even though it was 100 pages. Like I was just like, someone's saying it. And what's cool is that history is just the best in this way because so many things come to light when you read the history. At one point in my life, I thought I wanted to get a PhD in history. That was like what I was going to do because it's just so fascinating because you tell the story of what happened, but the people telling the story are the ones that decide the narrative of what happened. And so when you can go back and you have more facts and you can actually, so that's what he does because this guy is German. So he can read German, he lives in Germany. He was there when all this stuff was happening in Germany with Dr. Hammer. And so he was in this perfect position to write this thing and he took it seriously enough. Like it was big enough and had a big enough following at the time that he wrote this 100-page thing that is like extremely cited throughout. Like he really made it his research project. And that put a lot of things together for me because I was like, oh, here's where it came from. And you can start to see the evolution. You're like, oh, this was never based on something real. And it can, like, people today, I've seen some people say, like, oh, this is an offshoot of German New Medicine. So we're like making it better. And I'm teaching this better thing
Mm.
but it's not based on anything that was ever real. So there can't be an offshoot of it because when you go back and trace back what it's an offshoot of, all of that was false. So it was when I found that report, but I don't remember when, because I didn't start learning about cults until August of 2023, because that was a year since I had left the cult. So I spent like the year after out of my own cult being like, what happened to me? But being determined to like not see myself as a victim and just like not, I was still in this cult mindset of like, just basically, if I ignore it, maybe it'll go away and I can just, it wasn't that big of a deal. I'm just going to move on. And then I realized I started learning anything about cults. A friend actually pointed me to someone's Instagram who had left a cult. Like she had an ex-cult thing. And I started reading and I was like, oh my God, other people have gone through this too. And they all have the same experience as me, even though we've been in. And so that was like, I was so fascinated. And so then I spent the next whatever that has been year and a half ish, just reading stuff and learning and being like, oh, okay, and recovering. I think I'm like fully out of that cult experience now, which is amazing. I never thought I would be. I like couldn't even be inside my own head for a while because that's what it does too, is it takes over your way of thinking
Mhm.
because you start to use, like you noted, I said in the piece, the loading of the language, which is a thing cults do, but they the point of using all these terms, and GNM has so many of them, you start to think about everything. Like you have any symptom and you're like, oh, this is a conflict shock. And then you have to put it into these categories, and it restricts our ability to think critically, because now we suddenly we start putting everything in these categories, and we don't even realize that we're doing it, but we've learned this new way of looking at the world.
It's like a software program has been downloaded into your brain.
Yeah.
I just have to say. So yeah, cults and like a hallmark is confusion, right? What starts out feeling really clear over time becomes like just this morass in your mind, and this whole quote deprogramming process that so many people go through after they've left the cult and are like, what's real anymore? What's me anymore? Last night I watched one of the most fascinating moments I've ever seen on film. It's the documentary about the Sarah Lawrence cult. It's called Stolen Youth. It's on Hulu. I just got Hulu last week, and someone was like, "Oh, Hulu's like the best for cult content." And I was like, "Okay, I'm sure there's like one or two I haven't seen yet." But it's so fascinating that this is a really, really interesting, deep mind control cult. Just one man and a few people around him. But this woman, so she had just kind of come out of it, and she's being interviewed for this documentary, and she's showing this photo of herself as a child, and she's like, "What happened here was that, my dad was really mad, and it was really and then she's like, "Wait, no. That's not what happened. That's what he told me happened. That's what," and she's processing this in real time. I had chills. So that's, yes, this, once this thought program, or let's just call it a framework, because like you say in your piece, these people aren't stupid, and we don't want to come across as being like, oh my gosh, the people who fell for this. But once this framework has been fully absorbed in one's mind, then like you said, they don't even have to think about it anymore. It's just they have the symptom and they immediately know what the conflict shock that this one man said it is, and that's the only path that they follow in trying to heal.
Yeah.
I really want to talk about, so according to Dr. Moss, and Dr. Hammer healed his cancer through conventional means, which, chemotherapy, maybe radiation. And then later after he had developed GNM, right, his wife got cancer and died. And this was the part of your piece that I hadn't really come to yet, that I think is so essential for people who maybe are interested in this or really following GNM, is heads I win, tails you lose. You're right. It's a logical fallacy that means that one party always has the advantage regardless of the outcome. If the system or teachings don't work for you, it couldn't possibly be because there is something wrong with the system or teacher. Instead, it is always your fault. So tell us about how that applies to his wife's death from cancer, even though they had the Germanic healing knowledge.
They had the best system, but she still died of breast cancer. It's really sad because so what they did was she died, and they blamed it on her. Like they were just like, well, because that's what they do in GNM. When someone doesn't heal, they're never like, oh, it didn't work. They're like, they say something like the conflict was too much for the organism. So sometimes they have to say that, yes, people do still die when they know about GNM, because obviously they do.
Everyone who's ever known about
GNM. So the way they justify it is by saying like some conflicts are just too much for the organism. Like some can't be healed, maybe because they're too much, or maybe because the person just didn't do it right. So they kind of allow for both. Like maybe it was just too much for you, and that's, from what I can tell, that's what they say with Sigrid. I don't know how you'd say her name. His wife. She died of breast cancer. And even on one of the GNM main sites, they still hold that to this day. Like it was still there when I wrote the piece. Just it said like she never quite got over the grief of losing her son. And it's like, I think that should raise, like maybe, but also that's a problem.
Of course not.
Problem.
No one gets over the grief of losing their child.
But it's just you can't always have a way out, no matter what somebody experiences. And that's what cults do.
Exactly. It makes it undisprovable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If you come and say like I applied the GNM principles to this problem and I didn't heal, they're like, oh, you did it wrong. You applied the GNM principles wrong.
Yeah. Or that it's like a helpless option of like, well, I guess it was just like if someone dies, I guess it doesn't matter because then they're dead, but they're just like, oh, it's too much
Mm-hmm.
for them. And that's where I think, like I was saying earlier, I think it's sort of harmless if you're using it to think about a rash or whatever. But when you start applying it to these things that are a lot more serious, and then you're saying like, oh, if someone has cancer, it's just this conflict. And the tumor is just the body healing itself. Like you get all into this stuff that's extremely rigid. And a lot of people died in Germany. I don't know now what's happening with people or not, but a lot of people died that Moss kind of writes in his report. Like that's why the German people were coming after Hamer was like the doctors and stuff was because people were dying. Like he was forming these treatment centers
Mm.
so people could come and stay. And they have crazy stories like they didn't treat them, right? Because there's no treatment. That's another thing I guess we could get into. Like there's no GNM treatment. And so what he would do is just be like, oh, don't worry. You're just experiencing this conflict. And they would like sing songs and he would just leave them alone and then people died.
And he had to flee Germany because of this and died in
Yeah.
exile.
Yeah, he I think he flew somewhere in Scandinavia.
I think that this point is so important because so what's happening now is that a lot of people are getting quote trained in this, and I mean it's like herbalism. I always say this about herbalism. If you go to like an herb class, even if you get a little certificate, it doesn't mean anything like legally or and this is a couple people there's like multiple generations of this, right? There's Dr. Hammer. Was he a doctor? It's Dr. Hammer, right?
He was a
Yeah.
doctor.
Okay. There's Dr. Hammer at the top, and then there's like some boomers who brought it to the internet. Like you said, their websites look like they're from like the 90s. They're very old school looking websites. And then there's like women, more millennial women who are like influencers now and doing this online and doing consultations with people for hundreds of dollars or selling $1,000 courses on like, that time that you didn't feel worthy of something. And so there's no way to come back and say like, well, no, like what you told me actually didn't work. I paid you all this money and I still have this symptom. Well, you applied it wrong. I just think that this is a super important point so that people aren't driving themselves crazy. What am I doing wrong? Like these mental gymnastics trying to fit into a framework that actually doesn't correspond with reality.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big issue.
Okay, so that's your first principle here of all or what would you call these six?
The six aren't really, they're just things that I felt were prominent in GNM that also happen in cults. Because there's other criteria, like Stephen Hassan has this bite model for cults that you can like look at aspects of cults. There's Lifton, who has his 8 criteria for mind control. Like there are different aspects. So some of them, like loading the language, comes from Lifton. Like there are certain ones that come from that. But for me, I think when writing a piece, it's more interesting to like, instead of just go through these 8 criteria, it's like I kind of synthesize it as like, these are things that are really common in cults that stood out to me here.
Yeah. Okay. So we just talked about heads I win, tails you lose. We already talked about beliefs that are increasingly and absolutely certain, the iron laws, confirmation bias. I mean, that was the first thing I recognized. It's so this is, I think, the most common logical fallacy that the human mind runs. We all do this multiple times a day. Oh, see, told you. Like I knew it was gonna. It's when your pre-existing belief.
We can't escape it.
No. It's baked into the human operating system.
I think that's why, I think for me, having a cult experience was extremely humbling because it was just like, oh, before I thought I was very superior and I like knew everything and it was just like, wow, like I could fall for that. And I think you realize just how vulnerable we all are to these different things in different ways. I always know that somebody hasn't really studied cults or been in a cult when they're like, oh, people just go into cults because they like are having problems and they don't belong and they want to belong. It's like, it's a lazy interpretation of what's actually happening. Confirmation bias is what we're all doing when we're like, we have these preconceived notions and we look for what we want. And in GNM, it's You learn that there's a conflict, like that every symptom you have is caused by a conflict shock. And that's the other thing. So, like in cults, things become vague and the teachings become vague in different ways so that the members can use confirmation bias. And so in GNM, like the conflict shock at the beginning, it needed to meet these criteria. It had to be like Palmer's criteria of his shock. It had to be dramatic. And
I have your piece in front of me, the five criteria: unexpected, serious, highly acute, dramatic, isolative.
so it had to meet these things. But then obviously, when you get a rash or you have an earache, like you didn't necessarily experience something that was that dramatic. And that's why you have, as it's filtered down, it's become more and more vague. And you see on that one woman's website, I quote, like, she's like, you can, like, it might just be someone saying something mean to you, or it might be like you can even experience a conflict on behalf of someone else, which is great because so now you have these people who are really open-minded and who are like, okay, like I'll play the game. I'll look for where in my life could I have ever had a conflict that was like this one, especially recently. And so you comb through your whole day, and then you also have to comb through everybody you know because maybe you experienced it on behalf of them. And so like you're gonna find something. And when you have, like, you might not be able to find something very big, so you find something very small, and then they're like, yeah, well, that was your shock. And then they make it more vague by saying, like, she says, I have the quote there, but it's basically like the amount of the shock you experience is dependent on how you have experienced it.
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote this into me in your notes, was like, you're seeing humans then as so fragile because it's like, you're saying like, oh, my cat almost got hit by a car and that shocked me so much that now I don't know what the conflict would be, but you have some symptom now because of that.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, how many times throughout the day do we have these? There's no way to.
If it can be by proxy, like think about all the news you've taken in over your lifetime.
Yeah.
Like it's just so yeah, it's a way to make it vague so that your confirmation bias can constantly be like, yep, oh my gosh, that tracks. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
What she says, and this is in your piece, people want to go to the actual website, is so the conflict shock started out as having those 5 criteria, but later down on the same page, she then says human beings are able to also experience biological conflicts in a figurative sense. So it's like, oh, okay, just throw the whole thing out the window.
It gets crazy. Like when you really stop to think about it, but this is the kind of thinking you can't do when you've been so inundated. GNM's a bit less because it's not a cult, right? Like you haven't been fully indoctrinated necessarily in this way, depending maybe on who you are. But like it starts limiting your ability to really think about it critically. Like you don't stop and do that because your brain already feels like it knows. Like it knows these are the categories. But when you look closely at the nuance like this, it's like, okay, well now the term shock has no meaning whatsoever because it can be figurative, it can happen to someone else, it can you can find any way for any shock to occur.
Exactly. Undisprovable.
Yeah.
We already mentioned loading the language a few times, but like we haven't even gotten into the deeper layers of this philosophy. I think you say here, it's like, well, so what I'm thinking is it's somewhat meant to be confusing. 2, it's somewhat meant to make you feel like it's real because there's all this super special language. And then 3, it's also meant to like be an in-group signal to other people.
Yes.
Like, I know about the secret healing techniques.
I had an experience with a woman. I went to visit my family in South Carolina. My husband was with me. He was working with the husband of this woman, and we were out to dinner. They had traveled up to meet us. So I didn't know her at all, but she started telling me at dinner, somehow it came up. She's like 25 or 24. She was like, I'm a shaman and I also help people with healing. I don't know. She framed it in some way. And I was like, oh, German new medicine. She's like, yeah. And it was this moment of oh, we both know about this special secret thing. And it makes you, I think The reason I think culty stuff is so fascinating is because for me personally, at least, I can never 100% escape the pull. Like there's still a tiny part of me that wants to be like, yeah, I get it. I know it. I'm in with the group. And I don't know if we all have that, but I have it a lot. And I'm like, yeah, I know it too.
Yeah, of course.
And that's how everybody says it. They're like, oh, well, the GNM perspective is this.
Hmm.
And they say it with like this, there's this certainty of I have this secret knowledge. And then you're like, oh, well, I want to know what it is. It's
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate because there are a lot of people who are super invested in it as like a career that have real, genuine skills that could be brilliantly utilized not using GNM.
Hmm. And it's obviously like caring and compassionate people too
Mm-hmm.
who offer those services. They're like, oh, I learned about this amazing secret thing that most people don't know about. It helped me heal this thing. Like, how can I get this out there? Well, speaking of like this secrecy component of it, or not even secret, but like specialized knowledge, let's talk about his views on the Jewish people because this can't ignore this aspect of it.
People do try to, though.
Yes.
You won't see it mentioned anywhere, or people will just be like, oh, he didn't really think that, or they're just trying to like pin that on him to make him to take him down, or they're like, yeah, he thought that, but we have to separate like what he created from his personal beliefs. But and I'm a fan of that sometimes, but
Yeah, that's a really tricky line there, separating the work from the personal beliefs of a person. I sometimes I fall on one side, sometimes I fall on the other side of that.
yeah, I think that maybe when they're completely unrelated, maybe someone has some political belief you really disagree with, but they're like a crazy good, I don't know, like painter of nature. Like, I don't know, like when they're so different, it's like, okay, but you can't ignore that one of his main like beliefs with so what he believes for people don't who don't know is that he believes that the Jewish people know and have known all about German New Medicine and they have kept it on purpose away from the rest of the world. And they've hidden it and they've kept it secret and they won't let anybody else use it. Hamer grew up, the last decade of Nazi rule in Germany was the first like 10 years of his childhood. So that's where he came from. And you see it. And he says in his, this was the coolest part. And I wish I could have found more of the letters. So in Moss's report, he links to a lot of Hamer's letters that one of the major websites of GNM used to have displayed on her website. And that she used to display like here are all the letters from Dr. Hamer, public letters that he wrote to society or to whoever. She's since taken them down. So when you try to go, like Moss has all these citations in his report of her website, and you try to go to them and they don't exist anymore. And a lot of them, for whatever reason, even doing the web archive, either I guess the website wasn't popular enough to be crawled or something. I'm not a big tech person, but I did find one of them. Like one of the links still did work, and I could find, as I published in the piece, like the one of the letters that he wrote, and so it corroborated Moss's. He quotes from Hamer's letters directly in his piece, and there's all this anti-Semitic stuff. Like it's just extremely throughout, and what Hamer says is like, "Oh, I'm not anti-Semitic because I don't want all the Jewish people to die. I just want them to have to share." This with the rest of us. He uses some intense word. I don't know if you have it there, but it's like he wants to like essentially the Jews want to murder everybody else by like keeping it away from them. But he's not anti-Semitic. He just wants the Jewish people to share that. And he makes kind of crazy claims. Like they introduced a section. Yeah, what?
Medically execute.
Yeah, medically execute.
Jews are keeping GNM a secret from us in order to medically execute us.
Yes. And that's a letter he wrote. He wrote that letter publicly to a city in Germany because he wanted to get his dissertation approved by the university there. Like he was like, this is my German New Medicine. And they were like, no. And he was like, but so he was like trying to get the public behind him, like do you see what they're doing? And the Jewish people are being treated with German New Medicine. And of course, it almost seems absurd to even go through the thought exercise of like breaking all this down, but Moss kind of does it in his piece of like, if that were true, the Jewish people would die at way less rates than the rest of the population, which doesn't happen. It's actually the opposite in a lot of cases. But that's one of his foundational beliefs, is that the Jewish people have taken GNM away. And they even put it in the Talmud. Talmud? I don't know how to. That's
Oh,
like
wow. Okay, so
that's
he
like
is saying that they had this knowledge before he discovered it?
I'm not sure when he claimed. I don't know if he claims that they had it first or if I would think it's more likely he claims that they took it from him and are keeping it secret. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, because so I actually skipped the excerpt from the letter because you say right before you excerpt it there that you if you don't feel like reading this in full, I explain it below. So
It's
I
kind of weird to read because
but
it's
now
like,
that I'm reading it, this this guy is like crazy. These are like the ramblings of a mentally unwell person.
yes, yes. And so that's why you have to look at it and be like, it does matter
Yeah.
because this is the state of mind of the guy who's, yeah, I think it's just important the way that we like critically look at things and look at sources. And when you go back to really, like, you have to take the whole thing into context. And when you see him saying things like this, like you could get behind the idea. Obviously, there are times where the government or whoever tries to keep people silenced who do have alternative healing methods for things. Things like that do happen. But that doesn't mean that every time someone is silenced, it's because they're doing a thing that's true and good, and
Yeah.
someone's just trying to sabotage
So
it.
this I forget if this is how well you have this under outright delusion. So yeah, like I just said. But this is also another culty tactic is we are being attacked from the outside.
Yes. Us versus them.
Yes. Yes. He's got a lot of exclamation points in this letter.
Yeah, we're being attacked because you have to make people afraid of the alternative. Like you have to make people afraid of not being in the cult, of the people who are not in it, of what will happen to you if you leave. Yeah.
Well, everyone loves us versus them. It makes you feel more powerful. It embeds you more deeply in the belief system, or makes you feel more righteous.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love this paragraph in this section of your piece. No sane person would join something that right off the top says there is a cosmic overlord named Xenu who brought billions of beings to Earth, stacked them near volcanoes, and killed them with hydrogen bombs, whose souls cause mental illness and must be removed by doing expensive auditing sessions. But that's the deeper message that you are primed to believe once you are all the way recruited into Scientology.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, when we were talking about confirmation bias, it reminded me of when I first read about Nexium, like when Keith Raniere was first arrested, and there was just like all these sensationalized headlines, right? I just remember this headline about like sex cult and these women, and I was like, why would these women join a sex cult where they get branded? Like, God, they're so stupid. I'm like so superior to them. And then a couple years later, the Vow documentary comes out. And I'm like, oh, that's not what happened at all. No one joined a sex cult. That's what it evolved into.
The Vow is an excellent. It's probably I haven't watched a ton of them, but it's the best one I've watched at really documenting what it looks like what the joining of it looks like, because it does look so innocent and good on the surface, and you don't realize what happens the deeper that you go. And that's what makes a cult destructive is like it pretends often to be the opposite of what it actually is. And you don't know it because you believe like you don't know how you've been so primed to believe. It's crazy because you wouldn't think that your mind is so fallible, but it really is. We're really vulnerable when we don't know, especially. And also, I think we also want to all believe that it couldn't happen to us. Like we do that often, like someone gets in an accident and you're like, well, how did that happen? So I know that like that couldn't have been me.
Oh, I bet she was looking at her phone. I would never.
Like we all do it because we want, and it's human. I think it's like we want to be like, that could have never been me or someone I know.
Yep.
But
Yeah, totally common, like normal, acceptable, okay, human thought systems. But this is why I think learning about logical fallacies is like really important. Like I teach my children about them. And my junior year in high school in English, when he taught us about logical fallacies, and I loved it so much. And I saw that teacher a few summers ago, and I was like, thank you for doing,
Wow.
you really like set a foundation for me as far as thinking, and it's been extremely helpful. Okay, we already talked about a gift from God, like just this real evangelizing. This is
it. We found the way.
yeah, and we're here to like better humanity and raise people up and break through old paradigms. And it's very, and that's genuine, like especially for the people who join movements like this. Sometimes the leader is actually a shit the whole time, like Keith Raniere. Sometimes like Guru Jagat, I think she started out truly wanting to help people through Kundalini yoga, and then it like got dark. So, yeah.
There is always a mix because typically the leader has a lot of traits of narcissism, but narcissism is also on a spectrum. So we all have some amount of narcissistic traits. But then with narcissists, you have some who are more just like innocent, like they have the traits of narcissists, but they're not malicious, like they're not sociopathic or sociopath. And then you have ones that are. That was what I didn't realize. Like I believe that the leader of the cult I was in is a psychopath. Like I think she knows exactly what she's doing. But that was the hardest thing for me to even like grasp. And so that's why I say with Hamer, like, I don't know, he could have been, maybe he just was delusional and totally believed it. But you also have to leave the room. Like I wish I could have just told this to my younger self. Like I had never experienced such evil personally. And so to me, like the bad people were always sort of out there. Like it wasn't possible that someone I could love or be interacting with could be that evil and like malicious on purpose. And that was like a huge wake up call. And so I think we all just have to keep that in mind, that that is a percentage of the population. And you have to be skeptical. It's good to be open. And the more open you are, the more you need the protective skepticism.
Yes. The more you need to learn about logical fallacies. That's another reason I would have fallen into a cult in my 20s is, well, one, I was like a seeker, but two, I was raised by really wonderful people who would never hurt me on purpose. I was absolutely shocked when I got into a relationship in my 20s with a narcissistic person. I was like, oh my, whoa, people, like, I was shocked. People treat people like there really are people out. It's not just like the Hitlers of the world who operate like this. And yeah, and I noticed that over the years too of talking to women who had been in relationships with narcissistic men, is that there's kind of like the messy narcissists who are just like going through life, but then there's like the scary ones because they're really like organized and methodical and sinister. And
usually they're the ones we don't find out about because they're so good at it.
They're so smart. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd much rather be dealing with a sloppy narcissist because they're a lot easier to see from far away.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. Hamer, I haven't seen any evidence that he was malicious. I do think it's interesting, though, that like these two women who have the big websites, they're both Canadian, I think, and they both were with him in person very closely for a while. One of them, I think, for a long time. The other one, maybe for not as long. It's hard to know for sure. But I just think that's interesting because you don't know what that dynamic was like.
Right. Where's that documentary?
Yeah, like you just don't know. I mean, it's totally possible is, not malicious, but it also is possible that it is.
Yeah, totally. Well, he doesn't sound well in that letter, so we could be dealing with someone like that, or they could just all be like, let's heal everyone. Let's get this really important knowledge out there.
That woman I mentioned a bunch on there who has that main website, like she's done a lot of things to purposefully take stuff down. Like she's removed things. And so there's this sort of behavior that when you're in a cult so deeply and you really believe this, there's a thing in cults of the ends justify the means, right? Which means like basically anything you do, as long as it's serves the purpose of the ideology, it doesn't matter how bad the thing you do is because it's serving your greater purpose.
It's actually good for people in the long run, even if you're really
Yes,
hurting someone right now.
exactly.
They just don't know it.
Yeah. And so maybe she thinks that, but also, I don't know. It's hard for me to say, but like in my cult experience, there was a line of like behavior that I saw that was bad enough that I was like, this is really wrong. But some people don't like, they get really far. Like they'll participate in abusing other people, they'll like really go far. And so it's hard to know if somebody, like, does this woman have that sort of conscience and that sort of like, does she feel like she's doing it for the greater good, or is she just making a lot of money and wants to keep it that way and doesn't want, like it's really hard to know with people. It was interesting. I was gonna reach out to her. You can't even reach out unless for her on her website you put your address in.
Mm. Mm.
Like you can't even like send an email to ask her a question unless you like provide your address.
Oh.
And I thought that was a weird barrier. I don't know what. And I was gonna put a fake one in, and I was like, I don't think it's worth even bothering to try to talk to her. But
Mm.
it's a weird barrier from like being able to send an email.
Yeah, I've never heard of that before.
It's like, yeah, put in your phone number, your email, your home address, your it's like, okay.
Social security number. Yeah, well, that person, and again, we're not saying this woman is that person, but I often see them referred to as like the lieutenant. It's like Nancy Salzman in Nexium, where really they're a victim of the narcissistic, sinister cult leader, but then they also start victimizing other people because they are falling in line with the ideology and the ends justify the means.
Yeah.
Okay, I love this one. Proof is redefined. So tell us about the Hammer focus.
So this is the other thing that GNM does that makes it sound real. Like because I think most rational people when they first hear about it are like, okay, maybe.
Is
And
the
like,
proof?
it could be. And then you're like, then they tell you that on a CT scan, you can see proof of it. Like he has all these scans and it shows the shock and it proves it. And every time, like the shock is in the place that corresponds to the thing or whatever.
So in a certain, whatever your symptom is or wherever it happened in your body, there's a corresponding spot in the brain that if you look
Yeah.
at the CT scan, there's this little circle on that part of the brain.
Yes. And it shows it.
Yeah.
So then you're like, wow, okay. Like that sounds like proof.
Yeah.
But then when you go into it, I think that was kind of the final, like, you play Jenga or whatever, you pull out the piece that like makes it all collapse. That for me, I think was this moment of like, okay, like because so he makes this claim, but actually, so there's concentric circles that happen, like a big one and then a smaller one and a smaller one all inside the other.
There's an image of this on your piece.
Yeah, they have them on the GNM websites to be like, look. And so the thing is that in Moss and his report, that's well known. It was previously well known already to be a malfunction of the equipment of the machine. And they had even all the radiologists, like when they found out that this was happening, apparently there had even been this debate among like the scientists and the people like, oh, should we fix the machine? Like, do we need to recall this and figure out what to do? And they all decided, like the radiologists were like, no, because no radiologist would ever mistake that. Like, it doesn't look like anything else in the brain.
Yeah.
Like, we would never mistake this thing for something we're supposed to be reading.
It's like this perfect geometric circle.
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't happen in the human body.
No. And so they were like, everyone kind of decided like no doctor would believe that, like no radiologist would take this seriously. They would know that it's a thing. So like it's fine because it happens when the machine, I think when it gets out of alignment, something happens. And the way that they know this for sure, because you could still be like, but maybe, but they put a car in there. Mm-hmm. And even on a car, like the car will have the circles that can, so it happens like not in humans. Mm-hmm. And so then what happened is people started saying this, and so Hamer had a big problem on his hands because everyone's like, that's not the conflict shock, that's the malfunction. So he wrote to the company who makes the machines. This is back in the 80s. And he was basically like, how would we know? Like, what are some ways we could tell if this was a real conflict shock, like a real thing happening in the brain, and not just the machine malfunctioning? And so the company writes back and they give this document that's essentially like, it would have to meet all these criteria. So the document does not say, you're right, you've proven that these shocks are a part of the brain and real. The document that the company gave him in like the late 80s was like, it would have to meet all these criteria. And so then they decided in GNM, it does meet the criteria. And the woman has that document posted on her website, like, see? And she writes it as, back in the day, like they used to think that these circles were happening because of the malfunction of the equipment, but Dr. Hamer discovered that really they're real parts, they're shocks that are happening in the brain. So he was like the first one who brought this to radiologists' attention.
And then they say, look, we have this document from Simons proving it, when that's not what the document does at all. But no one's going to read the document. They're just like, great.
No. Proof. They're like, oh, there's a document that's there and it says it. And so, and the thing is too, like with a lot of these things, there's no way to, like, that all was happening in the late 80s. Like you don't have any way, especially when it's happening in Germany, there's no way to really verify any of it.
Yeah.
And so you're just going based on what these people are saying.
This to me too was like the final piece of, okay, like if that was real, that would be something, but it's not. Therefore, what other delusional things are being believed in this system? And so I was thinking about that for months, and I saw one of the big time, younger GNM influencers who makes all her income off of this, posting about the Hammer Focus and the Hammer rings. And I wrote to her, has that ever been verified in modern times? Like, has anyone recreated this study of within the GNM framework, do these rings show up on the brain in a corresponding spot? And her response to me was, no, but I'm positive they would be. That was the final moment for me. I was like, oh, are you?
That is that cult mindset, right? Because it's like you can't be positive. You can't know that.
Yeah.
But when you're in that, when you have this rigid belief system, that is what you think. Like you're just like, yeah, I know it.
Yeah. One piece of this that I have really been thinking so much about recently. So, okay, what I've sort of noticed, again, since it's kind of moving into this third generation of younger women, I don't know, I haven't seen any male like influence.
There was someone that I knew was learning from, there was a guy.
Okay.
Yeah.
But as far as, on social media.
But in general, it seems to be women, yeah.
I see it really moving in this direction of like, radical empowerment and sovereignty and, movements that I'm definitely like aligned with in a lot of ways. I like taking my health into my own hands whenever possible. Like, you say in your piece that you are healing your autoimmune condition. I've also been healing from like chronic fatigue syndrome in the last couple of years. And I didn't do any of that through modern medicine. I know that they can't help me there. But this is going to like really, really extremes where it's like the people who are really on the extreme edge of this particular sort of offshoot belief system of GNM are like, nothing outside of me penetrates me or affects me in any way. It's like their body is a closed system, which it is not. One of my podcast episodes in recent times is that your body is not a closed system. And therefore any symptom I have is the fault of my own mindset. Here is a quote that someone said on a German New Medicine podcast. I haven't quite gotten to that place yet. I'm actively working on getting there, where I have released the possibility that there is such a thing as an objective poison. It's like these people are removing themselves from ecology,
Mhm.
which is it's just completely insane to me. We are all interconnected with everything else, with the microbiome, with sunlight, sun signaling in the brain, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on and on and on. So to see this move into this realm where it's very main character syndrome,
Yeah.
it's very like nothing else is real. It's like I'm the only real thing, therefore I am all powerful. It's very like godlike,
Yeah.
really.
Hmm.
It scares me.
Yeah, it is scary. One of Lifton's criteria for mind control is called something like the demand for purity.
Yes, it's very purity mindset.
There's a lot of, and that's where like the us versus them thing comes from, but it's also like you see that in a lot of different cults. They want you to become more and more pure in whatever that means in terms of the ideology. And I think here that's shown in the more my mindset becomes perfect, the more like the less problems I'll have. Like nothing can touch me once my mind is perfect. And like you said, I mean, I think that we have to hold both. Like in my own healing, there's been a place of like taking full responsibility, but also holding the fact that like I don't know what my life path is supposed to look like. I don't know what God knows. I don't know. And I don't know what factors there might be that are completely out of my control. And so, like, it's kind of holding both. It's like, yes, I will take responsibility for everything that I can. And also, there's got to be this other room for like something else that's not just me and my like perfect, powerful beliefs.
Totally. I love that. It's both. It's I am a powerful person. I have a lot of effect over my life and my own well-being. Like I can take responsibility for a lot of things. And I am not omnipotent. I am not all powerful. I am not God. I live in a mysterious universe with other beings and influences moving through me all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, it loses that because it makes GNM into the ultimate truth and it also makes each person completely and fully responsible. It's an absurd thing to believe, but it's also not to me when like thinking about the cult mindset. It's like, of course, that's what it does. It becomes more and more rigid, it becomes more extreme over time. And so you do get to the place of being like, I'm striving for further purity. Like I need to become more and more clean, more and more perfect. And the more that I do that, and we want to feel safe. We want to feel like the car crash couldn't happen to us today. And I've heard people say that too in GNM, more like GNM offshoots, but people learning from people teaching GNM that even because I've been like, well, what about like my brother, for example? My brother was in a car accident when he was 17, I was 19. He has a traumatic brain injury. He's in a wheelchair. He like was supposed to die. He was in a coma. He's a miracle, but he's still extremely brain injured. And I was like, well, what about that? Because like, what's the conflict shock of that? And the response at the time was like, well, like this guy says that all accidents, like everything is actually caused by something. So like you weren't in the right mindset at the time. You weren't like they were still placing the blame for those things on the person. And you see that in a lot of new age stuff where it's like teachings that I think are really beautiful in themselves get taken and formed into this extreme, like if you walk out the door and break your ankle, you caused it. Like you were calling it in. That's what they say. That's the different cults. Scientology, they say you pulled it in. All cults tend to blame bad things happening in your life on you, and the good things are blamed on the cult.
Mm-hmm.
You are healing, good thing for you. You know about GNM and GNM has healed you, but if you are not healing, it's because you're doing it wrong.
Yep. This is like activating for me because I geographically live in a place where there's a lot of new age thinking and spirituality around. And oh, I've seen like narcissistic abusive people say to their partner or ex-partner, Like, you manifested this.
Yeah.
You know, it's your karma.
Mm-hmm.
It takes two. And I think that when I was young, like in my early 20s, I did somewhat buy into those belief systems. But as I started to see this over time happening to so many people I know, that was a shift for me too, of being like, fuck that. Oh my God, no. Like, in cases where there's an absolute aggressor, abuser, oppressor, all of that goes out the window.
Yeah. That was the problem I had really when I left the cult, was we were taught so strongly about victim consciousness and like not being a victim. And so I had this extreme belief that like you're either being a victim, a rescuer, or a persecutor. And if you're being any of those things, like that's your ego and that's just you blame it on you. And so I was like, I'm never a victim. I'm fully responsible for everything that happens to me. And then I realized that I was in a cult and I had this whole falling out, and it was very public and very intense. Like, the leader came after me. She turned everyone against me. They had like calls with hundreds of people just tearing me apart. It was like my whole world just shattered. My business shattered, everything shattered. And I was just like, and the thing that kept me from healing for like the first year was me being like, well, I'm not a victim.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like the main thing that happened that started my healing, was when I was like, I was a victim here. And that was hard for me to reconcile because it meant that I wasn't invulnerable.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so to be like it didn't mean that I had to take on like the identity of like, now I'm a victim and poor me and blah blah. Like, I didn't have to do that, which I think is where victim consciousness, like that's what it originally is referring to.
Right. And yeah, that can go too far to
But
what
it gets turned into like, and it was like, well, I was an actual victim and I didn't know what to do with that. Like, I had no framework for dealing with it. And so I couldn't do anything. So yeah, I think you see that everywhere in all culty things, is this, it'll always be blamed on you.
yeah.
A thing that the leader, Michael, used to say a lot is like, anybody who left, it was like, well, she didn't make it through. You
Mm-hmm.
didn't make it through. It's like you weren't good enough. She wasn't quite.
Didn't have what it takes.
Yeah. And you see that in cults when people leave, and you see it in GNM too when someone doesn't heal.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you see those people talked about, like his Hamer's wife, as like you see them talked about as these bad examples of like, she didn't get it enough.
Mm-hmm. She wasn't
And
pure enough.
so that keeps you from like, you're like, well, I don't want to be the person who like gives up too early or who doesn't. So you keep going. But you always know. I think that there's always like a teeny tiny part of us that's like, mm, no matter how much it's like overruled, that part of us that knows is still there. It's like waiting for us to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm. My mom died in a car accident 10 years ago. Like, fuck people who say stuff like that. I've hated that kind of thinking since before she died. I remember reading Ken Wilber's memoir about his wife
Mm.
dying of cancer. He's like this elevated spiritual teacher, you know, really prominent in the early 2000s. And in the memoir, he just kind of tears that whole philosophy apart, you know, because people would say to him, well, she must have had some impure thoughts, or, you know, she called this into herself. And it's not just a new age thinking either. Another cult documentary that I just watched on Hulu this week is The Way Down. It's a Christian fundamentalist church in Tennessee. This woman she started this fellowship, the Remnant Fellowship, and she also taught weight loss. It was basically it was starvation. This all happened like in the 90s, early 2000s. It got really, really bad, really, really culty, destroying people's lives. But of course, she has all the people who are, you know, still in it. And anyway, her grandson died as an infant, and it was never mentioned. Like, she went up and gave a sermon that week and didn't mention it because she had been preaching for so long that when bad things happen to you, it's because you're not in God's favor. And then a few years later, her husband, and 5 other leaders of the church died in a small plane crash.
And have they kept it going, the cult?
They have,
They
her
have.
daughter is keeping it going. It's
Usually they reframe a thing like that, and it sometimes it makes the cult stronger.
right, right. I'm not sure how they've reframed it. It seems like it's been somewhat secretive, but like, it's like, well, okay, within your system, that's proof that you were not in God's favor. And accidents just fucking happen. Cancer happens.
Yeah. I think that there has to be, it gets utilized in such a bad way. Because, like, who knows? I don't know if God has it. That's what people said so often when my brother was in his accident. Like, God has a plan. And I was so irritated. I was like, shut up. And I think there's a way, like, I've kind of come back around in my journey with my own faith of like having faith in something as like leaving it up to something bigger than me. Like something bigger than me knows more than me. But that doesn't mean that then we place all the blame for things on people and ourselves. Like we can't know at all why something happened. And you certainly can't say that it was because of the person. I think there's just so many ways that I think many different beautiful spiritual teachings get used and manipulated. They're really well primed for that. I'm
Yeah,
sorry about your mom. That's like the worst way. There's never a good way to lose someone, but it's a horrible way.
it is. Yeah, thank you. And my sister's husband had a really bad traumatic brain injury a few years later, too. So sorry about your brother. I know how completely devastating that is to a life and to the lives around them. But everything happens for a reason is an awful thing to say to someone, and grief to say to someone.
Regardless of what you believe, you should just never say it to someone that's just gone through a thing.
No, don't say it. It's like, yes, we can make meaning and possibly find growth and healing out of every difficult experience we go through, but that does not fucking mean that everything happens for a reason. And it's just the cruelest thing to say to someone who's had something really terrible happen.
Yeah, that's it's a whole other like thing to talk about is the way that people react to. I think
Yeah.
people don't know what to say, right? So they say all sorts of things, but they often say just the worst things that you could say.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're pretty much at the end here. A couple like other things in my notes were that this ties into what we were just talking about with like how sort of wildly self-centered it is, but this idea that getting help from the outside is having a savior complex. And then also just how it's like really this magical thinking, like what other people think are toxins, I think are all helpers. Just this way to continue chasing after a delusion of perpetual safety and power.
Mm-hmm. Someone I remembered a different guy who sent me like there's another guy someone referred me to. He was like, "Oh, you have to go see this post like this guy wrote about autoimmune stuff." And I went to his website and he was like an intense GNM person, but you can see it in the crazy utter certainty and like the godlike way that like one views oneself. Like this guy was just like, I've figured it all out. I've overcome everything. I know the absolute way. And yeah, making these big claims like, there is no immune system or there's so many different things that there's not actually even really an immune system. We've been lied to and your body's not attacking itself, it's attacking these other. And part of me, like, I don't really feel like my body is attacking itself. There's a lot there where I'm like, but when you just throw a whole thing out like that, I don't know if you saw something I was just watching. I hope this doesn't go on too much of a tangent, but like, I was watching Joe Rogan had this guy, Wes, Wesley Huff, who's like a Christian historian on. And the reason he had him on was because I guess this guy, Wes, he's like getting his PhD in some form of Christian history. He went on recently. The reason it came to Joe's attention was because him and this other guy, Billy, who like Billy he teaches something about like aliens and like how none of the Bible stuff can be real. Jesus was never crucified. Like he has all these things about. And what was really interesting, and so what happened was this one guy had Billy and Wes on to like have a sort of debate. And so this guy Billy, I think, is definitely a narcissist. Like he is so certain, he's really like braggy, his brags about his mansion and his money and whatever. But he knows that like the aliens were real and all this stuff has happened, and he goes to Egypt and he like shows all this proof. But as soon as he sits down with Wes, someone who's like an actual historian, you see it just all start to completely fall apart. It was very embarrassing for Billy. So then he wanted it to not get put up, and it caused this whole chaotic thing. And it did finally get put up. And I watched some of it, and it was like, it's easy for someone like this guy, the GNM guy I'm talking about online, to like make all these claims that sound super certain until they're sitting next to someone who actually knows, like who's an expert in what they're talking about. And then they can break it down and be like, wait a minute, like none of these things are true. And like you're saying this is based on this, but this is false, or this is like a false source. We know that this source has been a forgery or whatever. So I say all that to say it like, it's good to keep in mind, I'm not a person who is like, oh, just trust the experts at all. But you also, I think, want to keep in mind that like, if you're listening to someone who has no expertise really in anything, like it's good to be skeptical and be hesitant and be like, okay, you are so sure of this, but what are you basing it on? Because if you're just basing it on the fact that like you experienced healing and you've seen other people experience healing, but like that's kind of it, you just say so, that's not enough for people to not be getting treatment for their cancer because of.
Mm-hmm. Are there other explanations for that healing? Yeah, does this belief system like hold up to very basic tenets of logic? Which it's just the waters we're swimming in right now is, I mean, and again, like we've said, it's deeply embedded in like the human brain software, but just the internet has amplified, I think, or maybe it's just shown us what I have learned, maybe more than anything in the last few years, is that most people are emotional thinkers and not critical thinkers. And I'm not saying to discount emotion in any way, but we have to bring in critical thinking as well, especially with things like this, like you say in your piece, where death is a possible outcome of buying into this belief system.
Yeah. I just think like the parts of GNM that people have experienced healing from are not because of GNM. And that's what I want people to realize is like they are real. You may have really healed, but based on like the emotional pieces or the safety piece, it's not because of GNM. GNM is not a legitimate framework. And there's so many ways to see that once you start to look at the history and like really break it down. It's just like, so it's just, I wish people would stop like teaching these courses and like taking trainings and like doing all these. It's just like, it's not real.
Yeah.
And it's hard. I get that. Like, I mean, I had that experience. Like if it's someone's whole business, like I felt I had a coaching business, and when I left the cult, like my coach, everything had become so intertwined that I was like, oh my God, I've been like teaching all these culty things, and I just shut everything down. And I get that. It's a big loss. It's like shattering. But also there's got to be something in you, I think, that loves the truth, that like you care.
Right. Most of these people probably do have that small, still voice inside that you referred to earlier, being like, oh, that don't really make sense, but just moving right along. It helped me. It's helped me so much. It's helped people I know. It's good. It's good. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm this again, like I feel I was like shaking during parts of that conversation, just moving like deeply embedded emotions out and things that I've been thinking about for so many years and just hadn't really had like the right opportunity to talk about. And we talked about beforehand, especially when I considered reaching out to you since the day that was published, but I felt nervous, like I don't want to open myself up to attack. I really think that our approach is really grounded and compassionate, though. Another reason I just felt so resonant with you is that you're not just trying to tear something down or talk about these people like they're idiots. Because I don't want to get embroiled in like a back and forth with people, but because I do think that at some point in the future, some of these people are going to come forward and be like, yeah, I had my Jenga tower falling down moment at some point, and this is where I am at now.
It's only growing. Like sometimes it's easy to write off like like you said earlier, like we think like, oh, it's just a culty thing or like it won't last or what. Like we are in the age of cults. Like it's just spreading. Social media spreads it more. And it does sort of take on a mind of its own. It doesn't need one person to sustain it. But yeah, I think the more that stuff like this is out there, just kind of being like, please look at it more critically, I think is really important. And I also would just like, I think anytime we're able, like willing to admit that we were wrong and we don't know everything is a really important step for growth as a human. And so I think like anyone listening who has been really attached to it as a way of being, I would just say like, I think it takes even more courage to just be willing to let it shatter and find like the pieces that did feel really true, like find those in places that do like that are backed up by something and that are real because those exist.
Mm-hmm.
I think like people's brilliance would be serving the world better in a place that is legitimate.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to say that in like the last year, I've reached out to maybe 3 or 4 of the people who I most respect their knowledge on health and the human body, and just kind of like, oh, what do you think about German pneumonia? You know, not wanting to make anyone angry. And it was helpful for me that every single one of them was like, nah.
Yeah.
It was why I was like, okay, so it isn't just me. It is. And they felt the same way I do. Like, I'm afraid to say anything though, because it's so popular right now. And we're just in this, online space of a lot of contentiousness. And so thank you again. Just thank you so much I have been waiting for someone to write the piece that you wrote. It was better than I ever could have done it myself or imagined it would be. You helped me clarify some of my positions. And like I said at the beginning, I just think it's important that like your Substack piece, this podcast episode, just like have their homes on the internet so people can find them when they're trying to figure this out for themselves.
Planting a seed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on. It's nice to be able to talk about it.
Totally. I feel renewed. All right. Thanks so much for listening. And you can head over to the Medicine Stories Patreon to hear an extended conversation where Demetra tells me her whole cult story. I loved it. I could listen to people who have left cults talk about their experience endlessly. It is endlessly fascinating, this aspect of human behavior, relational behavior, cognitive behavior. And it was interesting to me to discover who she was talking about, who her cult leader was, because I realized that I knew who she was. Demetra does not say her name, and her reason for that she tells is really interesting, although she does say that she'll confirm for anyone who figures it out and asks. But it was just like, oh, I know who you're talking about. Yeah, I followed her for a while on Instagram, and I could tell things weren't right. Probably never would have thought about her again, but very interesting to hear this story that came out of her time with this person and this group of people. So that's there. Thanks for listening. I'm very curious to see what happens once this conversation is out in the world, who gets mad and who is grateful. So I'm about to find out. Okay, until next time.